Hey there everybody, welcome to Story Time with Jasper. I hope that you all are doing very well today, and I hope that you're ready for another story. We're actually picking up a story that we've already heard and we're catching up to right now, and that is Stuart Little by E.B. White. Now, last we left off with Stuart, he actually was trying to find Margalo. Remember Margalo, the little bird? So he's on the lookout for Margalo, and he's had plenty of little adventures throughout his time. Now we're going to jump into the rest of this book and see where does that story go. All right, are you ready? Are you comfortable? You have your comfortable clothes on, you have something comfortable to sit upon, and you have your favorite plushie somewhere near you? I got Zilla here with me, so let's go ahead and get our story underway with Stuart Little by E.B. White. Chapter 8, Anne's Crossing. In the loveliest town of all, where the houses were white and high, and the elm trees were green and higher than the houses, where the front yards were wide and pleasant, and the backyards were bushy and worth finding out about, where the streets sloped down to the stream, and the stream flowed quietly under the bridge, where the lawns ended in orchards, and the orchards ended in fields, and the fields ended in pastures, and the pastures climbed the hill and disappeared over the top of the wonderful wide sky. In this loveliest of all towns, Stuart stopped to get a drink of sarsaparilla. Parking his car in the front of the general store, he stepped out and felt the sun that was so good on him that he sat down on the porch for a few moments to enjoy the feeling of being in a new place on a fine day. This was the most peaceful and beautiful spot he had found in all his travels. It seemed to him like a place he would gladly spend the rest of his life in, if it weren't for that he might get homesick for the sights of New York and for his family, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick C. Little and George. And if it weren't for the fact that something deep inside of him wanted him to find Margalo. After a while, the storekeeper came out to smoke a cigarette, and he joined Stuart on the front steps. He started to offer Stuart a cigarette, but he noticed how small he was, and he changed his mind. "Have you any sarsaparilla in your store?" asked Stuart. "I've got a ruinous thirst." "Certainly," said the storekeeper. "Gallons of it. Gallons of sarsaparilla, root beer, ginger ale, moxie, lemon soda, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Dipsy-Cola, Pipsy-Cola, Popsy-Cola, and raspberry cream tonic. Anything you want." "Let me have a bottle of sarsaparilla, please," said Stuart, "and a paper cup." The storekeeper went back into the store and returned with the drink. He opened the bottle, poured out some into a cup, and set the cup down on the step below Stuart, who whipped off his cap, lay down on his stomach, and dipped some of the cool, refreshing drink using his cap as a dipper. "That's very refreshing," remarked Stuart. "There's nothing like a long, cool drink in the heat of the day when you're traveling." "Are you traveling far?" asked the storekeeper. "Perhaps very far," replied Stuart. "I'm looking for a bird named Margalo." "You haven't sighted her, have you?" "I can't say I have," said the storekeeper. "What does she look like?" "Perfectly beautiful," replied Stuart, whipping the sarsaparilla off his lips with the corner of his sleeve. "She's a remarkable bird. Anybody would notice her. She comes from a place where there are thistles." The storekeeper looked at Stuart closely. "How tall are you?" he asked. "You mean in my stocking feet?" said Stuart. "Yes." 2 inches, nothing and a quarter," answered Stuart. "I haven't been measured recently, however. I may have shot up a bit." "You know," said the storekeeper thoughtfully, "there's somebody in this town you really ought to meet." "Who's that?" asked Stuart, yawning. "Harriet Ames," said the storekeeper. "She's just your size, maybe a trifle shorter, if anything." "What's she like?" asked Stuart. "Fair, fat, and 40? No, Harriet is young and she is quite pretty. She is considered one of the best dressed girls in town, too. All her clothes are tailored especially for her." "That so?" remarked Stuart. "Yes, Harriet's quite a girl. Her people, the Ameses, are rather prominent in this town. One of her ancestors used to be the ferryman here in the Revolutionary days. He would carry anybody across the stream. He didn't care whether they were British soldiers or American soldiers, as long as they paid their fare. I guess he did pretty well. Anyway, the Ameses have always had plenty of money. They live in a big house with a lot of servants. I know Harriet would be very much interested to meet you." "That's very kind of you," replied Stuart, "but I'm not very much of a society man these days. Too much on the move. I never stay anywhere. I blow into town and blow right out again. Here today, gone tomorrow, a will-o-wisp. The highways and byways are where you'll find me, always looking for Margalo. Sometimes I feel like I'm quite near to her and that she's just around the turn of the road. Other times I feel like I'll never find her and never hear her voice again. Which reminds me, it's time I get on my way." Stuart paid for his drink and said goodbye to the shopkeeper and drove off. But Ames Crossing seemed like the finest town he had ever known, and before he reached the end of the main street, he swerved sharp left, turned off onto the dirt road, and drove down to a quiet spot on the bank of the river. That afternoon, he swam and lay on his back in the mossy bank, his hands crossed under his head, his thoughts returning to the conversation he had with the storekeeper. "Harriet Ames," he muttered. Evening came, and Stuart still lingered by the stream. He ate a light supper of a cheese sandwich and a drink of water, and slept that night in the warm grass with the sound of the stream in his ears. In the morning, the sun rose warm and bright, and Stuart slipped into the river again for an early dip. After breakfast, he left his car hidden under a skunk cabbage leaf and walked up to the post office. While he was filling his fountain pen from the public inkwell, he happened to glance toward the store, and what he saw startled him so that he almost lost his balance and fell into the ink. A girl about 2 inches high had entered and was crossing the floor toward the mailboxes. She wore sports clothes and walked with her head held high. In her hair was a stamen from a flower. Stuart began to tremble from excitement. "Must be the Ames Girl," he said to himself, and he kept out of sight behind the inkwell as he watched her open up her mailbox, which was about 1/4 of an inch wide, and pull out her letters. The storekeeper had told the truth. Harriet was pretty, and of course she was the only girl Stuart had ever encountered who wasn't miles and miles taller than he was. Stuart figured that if the two of them were to walk along together, her head would come a little higher than his shoulder. The idea filled him with interest. He wanted to slide down the floor and speak to her, but he didn't dare. All his boldness had left him, and he stayed hidden behind the inkwell until Harriet had gone. When he was sure that she was out of sight, he stole out of the post office and slunk down to the street to the store, half hoping that he would meet the beautiful little girl, half fearing he would. "Have you any engraved stationery?" he asked the storekeeper. "I'm behind on my correspondence." The storekeeper helped Stuart up onto the counter and found some paper for him. Small paper, marked with the initial L. Stuart whipped out his fountain pen and sat against a 5-cent candy bar and began to write a letter to Harriet. "My dear Miss Ames," he wrote, "I am a young person of modest proportions. By birth, I am a New Yorker, but at the moment I am traveling on business of a confidential nature. My travels have brought me to your village. Yesterday, the keeper of your local store, who has an honest face and an open manner, gave me a most favorable report on your character and appearance." At this point in the letter, Stuart's pen ran dry from the long words, and Stuart had to get the storekeeper to lower him head first into a bottle of ink so that he could refill the pen. Then, he went back to letter writing. "Pray forgive me, Miss Ames," continued Stuart, "for presuming to strike up an acquaintance on so slender an excuse as our physical similarity. But of course the fact is, as you yourself must know, there are very few people who are only 2 inches in height. I say 2 inches. Actually, I'm somewhat taller than that. My only drawback is that I look something like a mouse. I am nicely proportioned, however. I am also muscular beyond my years. Let me be perfectly blunt. My purpose in writing this brief note is to suggest that we meet. I realize your parents may object to the suddenness and directness of my proposal, as well as my somewhat mouse-like appearance. So I think probably it might be a good idea if you just didn't mention the matter to them. What they don't know won't hurt them. However, you probably understand more about dealing with your father and mother than I do, so I won't attempt to instruct you, but will leave everything to your good judgment. Being an outdoors person, I am camped by the river in the attractive spot at the foot of Tracy's Lane. Would you care to go for a paddle with me in my canoe? How about tomorrow afternoon towards sundown, when the petty annoyances of the day are behind us and the river seems to flow more quietly in the long shadows of the willows? These tranquil spring evenings are designed by special architects for the enjoyment of boatmen. I love the water, dear Miss Ames, and my canoe is like an old and trusted friend. Stuart forgot in the excitement of writing Harriet that he did not own a canoe. If you wish to accept my invitation, be at the river tomorrow about 5 o'clock. I shall await your arrival with all eagerness I can muster. And now I must close this offensive letter and catch up with my affairs. Yours very truly, Stuart Little. After Stuart had sealed his letter in an envelope, he turned to the storekeeper. Where can I get a hold of a canoe? He asked. Right here, replied the storekeeper. He walked over to his little souvenir counter and took down a little birch bark canoe with the words "Summer Memories" stamped on the side. Stuart examined it closely. Does she leak? Asked Stuart. It's a nice canoe, replied the storekeeper, bending it gently back into shape with his fingers. It will cost you 75 cents plus a penny tax. Stuart took out his money and paid the man. Then he looked inside the canoe and noticed that there were no paddles. What about the paddles? He said, making his voice sound businesslike. The storekeeper hunted around among the souvenirs, but he couldn't seem to find any paddles. So he went over to the ice cream counter and came back with 2 little cardboard spoons, the kind used for eating ice cream on picnics. These'll work all right as paddles, he said. Stuart took the spoons, but he was disgusted with the looks of them. They may work out all right, said Stuart, but I would hate to meet an American Indian while I had one of these things in my hand. The storekeeper carried the canoe and the paddles out in front to the store and set them down in the street. He wondered what his tiny boatman would do next, but Stuart never hesitated. Taking a piece of thread from his pocket, he lashed the paddles to the thwarts, swung the canoe lightly up on his head, and walked off with it as calmly as though he were a Canadian guide. He was very proud of his ability with boats, and he liked to show off. Chapter 9. An Evening on the River. When Stuart arrived at his campsite by the river, he was tired and hot. He put the canoe in the water and was sorry to see that it leaked badly. The birch bark at the stern was held together by a lacing, and the water came in through the seam. In a very few seconds, the canoe was half full of water. Darn it, said Stuart. I've been swindled. He had paid 76 cents for a genuine Indian birch bark canoe, only to find that it leaked. Darn, 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 he muttered. Then he bailed out his canoe and hauled it up on the beach for repairs. He knew he couldn't take Harriet out on a leaky boat. She wouldn't like it. Tired though he was, he climbed a spruce tree and found some spruce gum. With this, he plugged the seam and stopped the leak. Even so, the canoe turned out to be a cranky little craft. If Stuart had not had plenty of experience on the water, he would have gotten into serious trouble with it. It was a tippy boat even for a souvenir. Stuart carried stones from the beach down to the water's edge and ballasted the canoe with the stones until it floated evenly and steadily. He made a backrest so that Harriet would be able to lean back and trail her fingers in the water if she wished. He also made a pillow by tying one of his clean handkerchiefs across some moss. Then he went for a paddle to practice his stroke. He was angry that he didn't have anything better than a paper spoon for a paddle, but he decided that there was nothing he could do about it. He wondered whether Harriet would notice that his paddle was really just an ice cream spoon. All that afternoon, Stuart worked on the canoe, adjusting ballast, filling seams, and getting everything ship-shape for tomorrow. He could think of nothing else but his date with Harriet. At supper time, he took an axe and felled a dandelion, opened a can of deviled ham, and had a light supper of ham and dandelion milk. After supper, he propped himself up against a fern, bit off some spruce gum for a chew, and lay there on the bank dreaming and chewing gum.